In chapter 2, we review some of the classic research on intergroup relations and on how disadvantaged group members experience disadvantage and try to create change or respond to their situation. So we talk about, the whole literature on prejudice and discrimination and the experience that people have of ill-being and stress, but also internalizing prejudice and, taking it on board, blaming themselves, passivity, individual action. And then we review the whole literature on collective action. And then we problematize those literatures and say that they focus too much on groups in isolation, neglecting not just the dyadic relationship with advantaged groups that are trying to oppress them and struggling for power with each other, but also the many intersectionalities that people experience. So being in a group is different based on other groups that you're in. So to be an Australian is different for men and women and different for people from an English-speaking background and a non-English-speaking background and so on. And when I look at the kind of key learnings and that, feel really excited again by the chapter. And it talks about the way that disadvantaged groups try to build collective action, as well as their experience in systems of oppression. What are your thoughts on chapter 2, Kiara?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I'm particularly interested in that kind of systemic disadvantage level because I think so often that gets overlooked, particularly in cases where maybe laws have changed or processes at that higher level have changed and people don't appreciate that there's so many more subtle forms of systemic disadvantage and how those kind of continue on through generations and generations and that sort of thing. And I also really love like the approach to looking at how people process their own disadvantage and particularly narratives around like acceptance of personal disadvantage. I think that's a really kind of noteworthy one to me because I see it a lot in the domestic violence literature on a much smaller scale. Obviously that's kind of one-to-one, but then you see it at this like big broad societal level where kind of a way of processing or coping with the disadvantage is really that internalization and legitimization of the disadvantage from people who are disadvantaged because they're in systems where they don't really feel like they can change, and that's one of the options available to kind of self-preservation thing. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Keith?
Yeah, I think chapter 2 is like a good next step, like especially for the general audience in my perspective, because we talk about the collective action, which is something that people would think about when we talk about social change. So it's like we offer some new idea, I believe, from the lay audience perspective about the intersectionality, which I think is actually quite interesting. Like we've offer this idea for them to think about, like it's not just like protester or that group of people, but then they can share some identity with, like, the person who just sits still and reading the news or watching the news about that collective action. So I feel like this is like a great step to engage also. If you're a lay audience or the general audience who are not familiar with psychology, they can start with the collective actions and understand what is going on in this area in psychology. I think that's a great area to start.
Yeah, I agree. Cecilia?
The most interesting point from this chapter in my mind is that this chapter acknowledge the different forms of disadvantage. So it's not just talking about material, but sometimes being disadvantaged is also related to the symbolic and also related to something more complex or more systemic. And also this chapter also acknowledge the intersectionality amongst those different aspects of disadvantaged situations, like for example gender, race, where the intersectionality can add burden when you have more than one category of disadvantage in your experience.
Yeah, I think that's rich. And if people haven't come across that idea, they're probably not psychologists, because it's been really something that a lot of people have been thinking about for ages, but it's still so profound. It's such a profound point. And that's part of systems, is this idea of a big web of interconnection. And so at the same time as you're experiencing disadvantage in some ways, you may experience privilege in others. And that really affects your capacity and your well-being. So yeah, super, super interesting.